This is a reading of the end times as revealed to Maria Valtorta. 67. The Four Beasts of Daniel, January 5th, 1944. Complete dictation. Quaderni 44, pages 98 to 102. Daniel, chapter 7. Jesus says, Daniel is one who has the same tone as John, and John is the one who receives and amplifies Daniel's starting note. This is why, little John, you like him so much. Like a fish in a clear fish pond, Maria, you are happy when you move in the atmosphere of your Christ, who will have his supreme triumph at the hour when Satan and his son and his fawners have been made forever powerless. And in Daniel you find this atmosphere. Isaiah is the pre-evangelist who speaks of my coming into the world for the salvation of the world. Daniel is the pre-apostle, the pre-John, who foretells the glories of my eternal triumph as king of the imperishable Jerusalem. Now see how the signs of the diabolical ministers of the apocalypse are anticipated in the four beasts described by Daniel. Commentators have striven to give these four monsters a historical, human meaning, but it is necessary to gaze much further ahead and much further above. When you people meditate the holy books, arise from the earth, break away from the present moment, gaze into the future and into the supernatural. There is key to the mystery. The four beasts are the four errors that will come before the end, the four errors that will be four horrors for mankind and will beget the final horror. Human beings were demigods by grace and by faith. Like eagles and lions, they knew how to assail and crush the dangers of the senses and lift themselves to range in God's climes. There the soul is joined in supernatural wedlock to the Lord in swift, frequent unions of fervor. From these the soul comes down to earth refreshed every time in strength, joy, and charity, which it pours out onto the brothers and sisters. Then the soul hurls itself again, even more impetuously, towards God, because every union is an increase of perfection, which is fulfilled when the joining becomes eternal in my heaven. Atheism tore off the eagle's wings and the demigod's hearts from people, and turned them into animals, walking on mud, and carrying over the mud and mudwards their heavy hearts, all flesh and blood. People carry loads heavier than lead in their egos, bereft of the spiritual wings of the Spirit, weights that bend them, stretch them, cast them down into the mud. People were demigods on account of charity, living in them. By loving God and his law, which is the law of charity, they possessed God, and with God peace, which is a main attribute of God, and with peace much universal and individual good. People rejected God's law to adopt many other teachings, but none was or is from God, and so true charity is in none of them. Therefore, people who by embracing atheism had changed from eagles and lions into mere human beings, by infernal witchcraft, bred themselves into bears, wild devourers of their fellow creatures. But horror leads to horror. Horror escalates. It gets worse and worse because in their cursed unions with Satan, people whom Christ had brought back to their nature of demigods begets increasingly monstrous monsters, and these are the offspring of their error, as people sell themselves to Satan to have his earthly help. From the demigod human there came the human, from the human the bear, from the bear the new monster, bloodthirsty and treacherous like the leopard, endowed by Satan with many wings to be swifter in its harming. I told you people that Satan apes God, so he too wanted to give wings to his creature, to faithless, godless mankind, by then Satan's creature. He gave it no eagle's wings, but vampire's wings, so that it might be its own incubus and be quick in its rushing to fall on parts of itself, victims of itself, to suck their blood. I, mystical pelican, have opened my heart to give you my blood. Satan turns people to whom I gave my blood into vampires that suck parts of themselves and deal death to themselves in torment. Doesn't it sound like an incubus legend? On the contrary, it is your reality. It is not a mythical monster. You are the ones who, diabolically hungry, devour parts of yourselves, slashing each other's veins, maiming one another, and then producing new parts, while devouring the parts already formed, steadfastly with something maniacal about it, something of a diabolical maniac. Deliberate, extremist power, enforced all the way to crime, is the third beast, since it is a human power sold out to Satan to be more and more powerful against every divine and moral law. It farrows its monster called revolution, which by its nature carries in the protrusions of its monstrosity all the ugliest horrors of revolutions, the social shipwreck of good and faith, honesty, respect, morality, religion, freedom, and goodness die when this monster breathes onto a nation its infernal breath. Like a pestilential emanation, its breath spreads beyond the borders, infecting by itself peoples upon peoples until it infects the whole world. On the scraps of the victims which it killed and tore to pieces, and on the ruins of the nations reduced to rubble, it is preparing the cradle for the final monster, the Antichrist. I told you, people, that he will be the son of mankind's lust, born from lust's union with the beast. I told you, I do not change in what I say. What I say is true. I know it without needing to read it. I remember it without needing to reread it. It is written in my divine mind, before which all human events throughout time unceasingly pass by, one above the other, without one hindering the vision of the other. The Antichrist will be perfection of horror, as I was perfection of perfection, with his countless weapons symbolized by his 10 horns, by his iron-toothed jaw, by his ferocious feet, and finally by his small horn. He will torment you beyond measure. He will torment beyond measure those who, small faithful flock, remain my followers. The small horn also symbolizes the extreme malice with which Satan will endow his son, to intoxicate mankind while seducing it with his lying mouth, having himself worshipped as a god. Hour by hour the Antichrist's small horn shall grow in order to harm. His satanic intelligence shall grow to put in his mouth the most disturbing falsehoods, and he will grow in power as I grew in wisdom and grace, armed as he will be with eyes to read the thoughts of holy people and kill them for those thoughts. Oh, my end-time saints, if the living of the earliest saints amidst pagans' persecutions was heroic, the living of my last saints will be 3 times, 7 times, 7 times, 7 times heroic. Only those fed on the marrow of faith will be able to have lions' hearts to face those torments, and eagles' eyes and wings to stare at me, sun, and fly to me, truth, while darkness overwhelms them on all sides, and falsehood seeks to persuade them to worship it and believe in it. After the forerunners of the Antichrist himself will come. The anti-Christian period is symbolized by the beast armed with 10 horns, Satan's 10 slaves, who consider themselves kings. 3 of these, note well, will be torn off and cast into nothingness, namely into the abyss, where God is not, and so where nothingness is, the opposite of God, who is everything. The anti-Christian period will climax in the birth and growth until its greatest power of the 11th horn, the reason for the fall of its 3 forerunners and the seat of the real Antichrist. The Antichrist will blaspheme God as no son of man has ever done. He will ride roughshod over God's saints and torture Christ's church. He will think, because he is son of the union of demoniac pride with human lust, that he can do great things, changing the times and the laws, and for 3.5 years he will be horror, ruling over the world. Then the Father will say, "Enough," in front of the great chorus which shall be made in heaven by the noise of the great words of the saints, and the wicked beast shall be killed and thrown into the shaft of the abyss, and with it all the lesser beasts, to remain there with Satan, their breeder, for eternity. I shall then be called by the Father to judge the living and the dead, in accordance with what is said in the symbol of the faith, and the living Those who have kept life within them by having kept grace and faith alive shall inherit the kingdom, the power, and the majesty of God. The dead of the Spirit shall have never-ending death, in accordance with what their will chose to have. And there shall no longer be earth and carnal human beings, but there shall be only children of God, creatures free from every sorrow, and there shall no longer be sin, and there shall no longer be darkness, and there shall no longer be fear, but only joy, joy, immense, everlasting joy, inconceivable to human beings, joy to see God, to possess Him, to understand His thoughts and His love. Come, O people, to the fount of life. I open its springs for you. Draw from it. Strengthen yourselves in it, to be fearless in the trials, and to manage to dive wholly into it, into me, the spring of bliss in heaven. This beautiful heaven was created by my Father for you. There you are awaited by the threefold love of the one God, and by the purity of our Mother, and by those who, for having been faithful, have already obtained life. Priests versus the Antichrist. 68. Since priests have a key role to play in postponing the time of the Antichrist or defeating him when he does manifest himself, their faults have terrible repercussions. That is why Jesus rebukes his priests in the following extract, exposing 4 deadly faults already found among many of them in the 1940s. January 27, 1944, extracts, Quaderni 44, pages 107 and 109 to 112. Jesus says, "This is a page sad to dictate, to write, and to read, but it is the truth and must be told. Write it. It is for the priests. I have called you shepherds. I called you neither loners nor captains. The loner lives by himself. The captain marches at the head of his men, but the shepherd is in the middle of his flock and watches over it. He does not keep to himself because the flock would scatter. He does not walk at the head because the heedless sheep in the flock would wander from the way and be prey to wolves and thieves. The shepherd, if he is not a madman, lives in the midst of his flock, calls it, gathers it, unflaggingly goes back and forth beside it, goes before it in difficult matters, is first to test the difficulties, smooths them out as best he can, toils to make the awkward thoroughfares safe, then stays at the hard spot to watch his sheep pass by, and if he sees a fearful or weak one, takes it on his shoulders and carries it past the hazardous spot. And if the wolf comes, he does not run away, but hurls himself at it in front of his sheep and defends them, even at the cost of death, to save them. He immolates himself for them, to satisfy the wild beast's hunger, so that it may no longer feel the need to tear to pieces. How many wild beasts there are against souls! The shepherd does not get lost in pointless chats with passers-by, and does not amuse himself at the back with things that are not up to him. He takes care of his flock, and that is enough. Now look, doesn't it seem like reading chapter 8 of Ezekiel? First idol, jealousy. You should be charity, right? Charity to induce others to charity. What are you? Jealous of one another. You take offense if a layman criticizes you, but don't you criticize one another, and often unjustly? The superior criticizes the subordinates. The subordinate criticizes the superiors. You are jealous if one of you is noticed, if one of you does better than you, if one of you becomes richer. This, which should horrify you, is on the contrary what makes your mouths water the most. But was I, the eternal priest, rich? Be perfect, and you will be noticed and praised, however much you should care only about God's glory. Be perfect, and you will do well in the only purpose worthy of your garment, that of bringing souls to God. Second idol, actually many idols, the various heresies that replace in you the creed you should have. You too, like the 70 elders spoken of by Ezekiel, are incensing idols, each one the idol he prefers, and you do so in the dark, hoping that people's eyes may not see you. But they do, and you scandalize them, because the faithful and people in general are like children. They do not seem to be watching, but they never stop keeping an eye and an ear on the grown-ups. But don't you know that even if people did not see, God does? Why then do you give off your incense before the power of gold of that of man, or that of man? Don't I notice from the height of my throne too many of my priests busy devoting their time, that time I give them to spend in their priestly mission, devoting their time in human business to increase their well-being? Yes, I see that. Don't I notice? And it nauseates me. Too many of my priests abjuring my law to abide by the law of wretched men, expecting honors and money. Yes, I see that. Oh, politicking priests, today's Sanhedrists, let them remember, though, what end the Sanhedrin met precisely at the hands of those at whose feet they had thrown their consciences flat and broken my law. And I say no more. This is as far as mankind is concerned. The rest will come from the eternal and just judge. Third idol, the senses. Yes, there is this too, and I say no more out of respect for my megaphone. But let each one examine himself to see if in the place were only women lawful to remember with love by a priest, my mother and his own mother, there might be a pagan goddess. Think, you touch me, you receive me, and that is enough. Do not put the most pure in contact with the flesh, stained with lust. Fourth idol, the worship of the Orient. The sects. Yes, this too. And shouldn't I look at many of you indignantly, and have for many the rebukes that I had for the Pharisees and doctors of the law of my time? And shouldn't I kindle some lights among the lay people who love me as many of you do not, out of compassion for the souls whom you leave in the cold, in the dark, in impurity, the souls for whom you are not a way to God, but a path leading downwards? And how dare you repeat my word and preach my law, when word and law are a condemnation to you? May those who are undefiled become even cleaner. May those who defiled purify themselves. Mankind is at a great road fork. Two ways branch off. One climbs up to God, the other goes down to Satan. At the road fork there is a rock, that is you. If you turn into a bulwark and a thrust towards the first way, Satan will not burst in, and souls will be spurred on to God. But if you are the first ones to roll down Satan's slope, you will drag mankind with anticipated time towards the horrors of the Antichrist. And although he must come, woe betide those who anticipate his coming and lengthen it, because he shall cease to live at the hour set from everlasting, and the longer the time of his stay, the more souls shall be lost. Not one of these shall go unavenged. Remember that. Why, if your God sees the sparrow that dies, how could he not see a soul that dies? Those who kill it, whoever they are, shall have to render an account to me, and I shall mete out their condemnation.